And our next speaker in the New Work on Paradoxes online conference at the University of Bucharest is Mr. Ibrahim Dagher. Mr. Dagher is coming from the University of California, Davis, and his talk today is titled Linking the Grim Reaper and Grandfather Paradoxes. We're very grateful. I believe it's very much early in the morning for him. So Ibrahim, wonderful meeting you, and please take it away.
Thank you very much. So I'll share my slides now. Can everyone see this? Yes, I hope so. Okay, so yeah. Thanks everyone for coming. Today I'll be speaking about some new work, I think, on linking two interesting paradoxes, the Bernardetti, or what's often called the Grim Reaper paradox, and the grandfather paradox. So broadly, what my interest is in this metaphysical thesis called causal finitism, which states that necessarily the causal history of any event is finite. Another way of thinking about this thesis is that backwards infinite causal chains are metaphysically impossible. This thesis has gotten much attention, particularly in the literature on the philosophy of religion, because it plays an important role in many kind of cosmological arguments, but it's an interesting and independent metaphysical thesis as well. And the most prominent argument for causal finitism is the Grim Reaper argument, or the Bernardetti argument. This argument is paradox-based. Namely, the argument is that causal finitism is the best solution to the Grim Reaper paradox. Now, my goal in this talk is to make contributions to the dialectic on causal finitism concerning this particular argument. And my contention is the following. I believe there's a deep similarity between this argument or paradox and the grandfather paradox. And so I believe that we can apply methods and insight from the literature on time travel and the grandfather paradox to the Grim Reaper argument. So I think there's really interesting interplay that the current literature lacks. So the plan for this talk is to first explain what the Grim Reaper argument is, and in particular, I'll explicate its most current variation as argued by Alexander Proust. And then I'm going to summarize some recent work on time travel and show how it can make new work and uncover a new objection to the Grim Reaper argument. So first, I want to explicate the Grim Reaper argument. So imagine with me that there is a lamp with a switch, such that whenever the switch is hit, the lamp switches its state from on to off, or else from off to on. Now, a Grim Reaper is a machine which, when set for a time, checks the state of the lamp at the time. If the lamp is off, the Reaper turns the lamp on. And if the lamp is on, the Reaper does nothing. So we can imagine that each Reaper is equipped with a dial such that it indicates the time that it's going to check the lamp at. Now imagine further that there are infinitely many Reapers, one of which is set to check the lamp at 11, another at 10:30, another at 10:15, 10:07.5, and so on. The idea is there's infinitely many Reapers getting closer and closer and closer to 10 o'clock. Now let's make a couple more stipulations. Let's stipulate that the present time is 9 o'clock. The lamp is off, and that nothing besides the Reaper can change the state of the lamp. So we'll call this the Grim Reaper story, right? And the idea is this is a pretty innocuous story, pretty simple. But we already have a problem. Consider the state of the lamp at 11:01. Is it on or off? Well, it must be on, given that the 11 o'clock Reaper will either flip it on or else do nothing because it was already on. So we've established that the lamp has to be on at 11:01. Now, we set up already that the lamp is off at 9 o'clock and on at 11:01, and only a Reaper can change the state of the lamp. So some Reaper must turn the lamp on. But which Reaper is it? It can't be the 11 o'clock Reaper because the lamp can't be off at 11 o'clock, since if it were off, the 10:30 Reaper would have already turned it on. Is it the 10:30 Reaper? Well, no, for the same exact reasoning applies. The 10:15 Reaper would have already turned the lamp on. And in fact, as you can see, this reasoning applies to all the Reapers. For any Reaper Rn, there is going to be some Reaper Rn plus 1 set for an earlier time that makes it such that Rn isn't the Reaper which changes the state of the lamp. So no Reaper changes the state of the lamp. And so the lamp doesn't have its state change. And so it remains off because only the reapers can turn it on. But we already established the lamp doesn't remain off. And so we have a contradiction. So the real question is, what do we draw from this inconsistency? Because there's no question this is an inconsistent setup. The problem is that it seems like each step we took to construct the story was perfectly kosher. And so Alexander Proust and causal finitists generally think that the lesson here is that infinite causal chains are metaphysically impossible. If we rule out that possibility, we rule out the story. And this is particularly supported by the following intuition. It seems as though if you could have infinite causal chains, nothing would impair a clever engineer from actualizing the exact setup of the Grim Reaper story, right? It seems like if infinite causal chains are possible, this scenario is possible, but it isn't, right? So Proust uses these intuitions to develop the argument. If causal finitism is false, right? If infinite causal chains are possible, then the Grim Reaper story is possible, but that story isn't possible. And so causal finitism must be true. Now, the main objection to this argument is the following. Consider these two propositions. The first one we'll call infinite group. So this is a proposition that states there is a linearly ordered set S with no first member. Now consider another proposition. There is a property P such that for all members of S, P is true for that member just in case P is true nowhere before. These two propositions are actually inconsistent, and it's for the same reason as the Grim Reaper story, right? Just ask yourself, can P hold for M1? Well, it can only hold for M1 if it holds nowhere before M1. But if it holds nowhere before M1, then it must hold at M2 because it only holds at M2 if it holds nowhere before. But if it holds at M2, then it doesn't hold at M1. And so the same reasoning applies to all the M's. And so nobody in the set has the property P. But if nobody in the set has property P, then M1 must have property P. So you get the same kind of inconsistency. And so the idea is the Grim Reaper story is just an instance of this broader schema. Now, you might think, okay, well, how is this supposed to be an objection? Here's the thought. Causal finitism now seems to be an unnecessary solution to the Grim Reaper story. The causal finitist solution is to say that infinite group is metaphysically impossible, right? You can't have infinite causal chains. But the fact that these two propositions are jointly inconsistent shouldn't compel us to think that either one of these propositions is impossible. All we should say, given the formal proof, is that their conjunction is impossible, right? So the idea is that in this three-step argument, the first premise has now lost its plausibility. There's no reason to think that if causal finitism is false, that is to say, if it's possible to have an infinite causal chain, then the Grim Reaper story is possible. Because even if one denies causal finitism, it's unclear why they should then accept the joint possibility of these two propositions. They're still logically inconsistent. They're unsatisfiable. So the idea is there's a much easier solution to be had. Namely, you can have infinite causal chains, but they can't have a particular structure. Basically, you can't satisfy both of these propositions because that's impossible. And the idea more broadly is when you discover that the conjunction of two propositions is inconsistent, you aren't compelled to deny the possibility of either conjunct. Absent independent support, opponents of causal finitism just have no reason to accept the first premise. So it needs more motivation. Proust's response to this objection is to motivate the claim that if causal finitism is false, the Grim Reaper story is possible. Here's how he does it. So consider a revised version of the Grim Reaper story, where everything's identical to the original setup, except that there's an additional Reaper whose dial is set for 959. We're going to call this the prefix Reaper story. So everything's the same, but there's an additional Reaper at 959. Notice that this setup is perfectly consistent. When the lamp is off at 9 o'clock, when 9:59 rolls around, the 9:59 Reaper turns the lamp on, the rest of the Reapers do nothing. So, unless you think infinite causal chains are impossible, unless you're a causal finitist, There's no reason to deny the possibility of this story, right? This setup is totally fine. However, Proust argues that this is going to spell trouble. Because imagine the existence of a tinkerer, Jimmy, who can turn the dial of a reaper to a different time, right? So we imagine that these reapers, they have dials that set what time they're going to flip the lamp on. So imagine that we just have someone who walks up to the 9:59 reaper and attempts to turn the dial to 11:01. In other words, he attempts to turn the 9:59 all the way to 11:01. Well, what would happen? We'd be right back to the original scenario, right? And that, we all agree, is impossible. So the idea is Jimmy must fail. Jimmy cannot, if we imagine that this situation is actual, Jimmy could not turn the dial, because if he did, we'd be in a logically inconsistent scenario. So somehow Jimmy is going to be forbidden from turning a single dial. To quote Proust, we have to suppose some strange metaphysical force preventing Jimmy from turning the dial. And yet, it seems perfectly possible for him to turn the dial. It seems like dials should generally be able to be shuffled and moved around. It is a mark against a theory that it makes the Grim Reaper story impossible, but the prefixed one possible. So the idea is we can't say that this scenario, even though it's totally consistent, we shouldn't say that it's metaphysically possible. And yet, there seems to be no good reason to deny the possibility of this situation, unless you're a causal finitist. So here's the new argument. If causal finitism is false, then surely the prefix scenario is possible. But if the prefix scenario is possible, then surely the Grim Reaper scenario is possible, because all you have to do is turn the dial. But that's not possible, and so causal finitism is true. So the only premise in this new argument that might be controversial is 5. But 5 seems to be pretty well motivated. Our modal intuitions strongly point to the fact that if a prefix scenario is possible, right? If you have the same setup, but just an additional reaper at the beginning, surely you could just turn the dial. At this point, the literature has gotten into a bit of a stalemate. There isn't much work done now that has settled things decisively either way, or made some new substantive contribution. It seems like things now might just sort of fizzle down into differences about modal intuitions. But I think we can actually develop a new substantive objection to this premise by turning to some recent work on the paradoxes of time travel. I think we can actually help see what's going wrong here if we consider time travel. So this is paradoxes of time travel, also called the grandfather paradoxes. Informally, this is how they go. If backwards time travel is possible, then a time traveler, Tim, could, with a rifle, travel to a time where his grandfather has yet to meet Tim's grandmother. However, if Tim does that, then surely when he's time traveled back, he would have the ability to fire his rifle. So there's a metaphysically possible world where he fires the rifle. But there's no world where Tim fires his rifle in these circumstances, right? You can't kill your grandfather before he met your grandmother. So the argument goes, backwards time travel must be impossible because that situation is just absurd. And so I want to make an observation here. Notice that the grandfather and reaper arguments both contend that if something were possible, then it would be possible for another state of affairs to obtain. Now, I want to show you that the similarity is actually even deeper. So Nick Effingham has just in 2020 published a really novel book examining these paradoxes of time travel. And so he formalizes this line of thought as a reductio with 4 central premises. So this is how he thinks arguments against time travel operate. So the first premise is, let's assume for reductio that time travel is metaphysically possible. The first conditional is, if time travel is metaphysically possible, then it's metaphysically possible for Tim to be in the correct circumstances, namely circumstances where he's traveled back in time and he's pointing the rifle at his grandfather. But the idea is, if Tim were in the correct circumstances, then Tim would have the ability to pull the trigger of the rifle. And then there's this general principle that if an agent is able to do something, then there's a possible world where they do that thing, right? So this is how the argument proceeds, right? So if time travel is possible, then it's possible for me to travel back in time. and be standing next to my grandfather. But if I'm standing next to my grandfather, then I'm going to have the ability to shoot him. And if I have the ability to shoot him, then there's a world where I shoot him. So starting with the assumption that time travel is possible, these three conditionals get us to a possible world where Tim shoots his grandfather. But obviously there's no such world. So by reductio, time travel is not possible. So if we want to resist the conclusion that time travel is impossible, one of these conditionals has to go. Now, Effingham's argument is that possibility, that last principle, is actually false. And there are a number of motivations. So his conclusion is actually, you can have the ability to do something, even if there's no world where you do it. In other words, agents can have the ability to do the metaphysically impossible. That's Effingham's solution. Now, before I get to whether that's a good solution or not, what's especially interesting is that this exact argumentative style captures Proust's reasoning with the prefixed reaper, right? Because Proust's reasoning was the following. If an infinite causal chain is possible, then surely Jimmy could be in circumstances where he's standing next to the 959 reaper in the prefix situation, right? So if an infinite causal chain is possible, then surely you could have this setup. But if Jimmy is in these circumstances, then he's going to be able to turn the dial. So there's a world where he turns the dial, but there's no such world, right? And what's really interesting is we can mirror the exact same formal structure. So we can make the same exact argument as Effingham did in the original book, but just replace time travel with infinite causal chains. And you'll get the same exact argument. So infinite causal chains are possible, we assume for reductio. Well, if they're possible, then it's possible for Jimmy to be in the correct circumstances. But if Jimmy's in the correct circumstances, he's going to have the ability to turn the dial. And then you have this general principle. If an agent is able to do something, there's a world where they do it. So there's a really kind of astonishing symmetry here. And so unless you think there's some asymmetry between firing a rifle and turning a dial, Effingham and Proust's arguments are, in most important respects, the same argument that have been developed independently. So this is kind of really, really interesting. So another way to see things is the key premise for Proust was that this premise that if the prefix Reaper scenario is possible, right, the one with the 959 Reaper, then the Grim Reaper scenario is possible. And what Effingham's structure has revealed to us is that this conditional is subtly being supported by actually two counterfactuals. If Jimmy were in the correct circumstances, the prefixed Reaper scenario, then Jimmy's going to have the ability to turn the dial in those circumstances. And if an agent is able to do anything, then there's a world where they do it, right? So these are actually the support for 5 that Proust was subtly using. Now, again, like I mentioned before, Effingham's solution to the grandfather reductio is to deny possibility. Just because an agent is able to phi doesn't mean there's a world where they phi. And the reason he says this is because if you actually think about it, in this context, when people are talking about someone traveling back in time and he's able to fire a rifle, the word able to, has the ability to, is being analyzed as a very special kind of counterfactual. Namely, so when we say that Tim is able to shoot his grandfather, what we mean is if Tim were to try to shoot his grandfather, then he would shoot his grandfather. But that counterfactual, there's no possible world where the antecedent obtains. There's no possible world where Tim shoots his grandfather. So the only way we can analyze that counterfactual and have our semantics produce that it's true is if the nearest possible world is an impossible one, right? It's one where Tim shoots his grandfather. And so we can accommodate that with some work on counterpossibles. But the idea is when we're analyzing able to, ability in this special way where we use impossible worlds, there's no longer reason to think that if an agent has the ability to phi, there's a world where they phi, precisely because we're analyzing ability with impossible worlds. And in fact, besides this one, there are a growing number of arguments coming from wide-ranging areas outside of this literature against possibility. So this possibility principle is very controversial. And so what's really interesting about this symmetry is that we've shown that Proust's argument has actually relied on possibility. And so we should just deny this principle of possibility. And if we do that, we can now create an objection to Proust's argument, namely that it relies on a false principle, right? In other words, the solution here is to say that Jimmy has the ability to turn the dial, but that doesn't mean that there's a possible world where he does, right? Where the Grim Reaper scenario obtains. Now, there are many, many arguments against possibility. Because I'm running short on time, I don't want to get into too many of them, but this is one that I do want to survey. So Jack Spencer makes this argument. He says, here's why you should think that agents have the ability to do things that are impossible. Imagine a world with a conjunction of laws and conditions, we'll call it H and L. Now, these laws, these physical laws, entail that an agent will not come to know the laws. That's just what they deterministically entail. Now, because knowledge entails truth, it is metaphysically impossible for the agent to know H and L, right? Because if they know H and L, then H and L obtain, and H and L entail that the agent won't know H and L, right? So it's impossible for the agent to know these laws. But for all that, it still seems as though the agent is able to know them, right? He's got the ability. Maybe he's very smart and capable and brilliant, right? So it seems like even though it's metaphysically impossible that the agent comes to know the laws, he's still got the ability to. Michael Farah also argues for this thesis in a different way. The example he uses is, suppose that in the actual world, I do not know the following proposition, Q. There are actually 76 French fries on my plate. So I don't know that actually there are 76 French fries on my plate. Now, assuming that it is impossible for someone in a non-actual world to have knowledge of the form actually P, it follows there are no worlds where I actually know this proposition, because the only way I could know a proposition with the actuality operator is to be in the actual world. So it is metaphysically impossible that I know Q. But it still seems as though I've got the power to know this, right? I'm able to know the proposition. It's simple, it's not too complicated, it's not beyond my ken. And so same kind of argument. Another argument is in theology. It seems like God has the ability to actualize gratuitous evil, that is pointless evil, even though there's no possible world where he does. Many theists think that it's impossible for God to do evil, right? In the sense that there's no possible world where he does, but it still seems as though God's got the ability to do it. So that's another motivation for denying possibility. God's an agent. He can have the ability to fly, even though there's no world where he does. So the broad lesson here is we often enter scenarios where our normal abilities aren't actualized in any world, but intuitively we still retain these abilities. And so you can just argue that the same thing is happening in this scenario, that basically, sure, intuitively, Jimmy is able to turn the dial, but that doesn't commit me to a possible world where he actually does. And so, yeah, hopefully, I mean, I think that this response is hard to see unless you kind of show the symmetry between the time travel literature and the causal finitism literature and show that actually these are the same exact arguments happening in different places. So before I end things, I guess, want to leave you with some final thoughts. So first, I hope to have shown that there's a fruitful, interesting symmetry between the traditional Grim Reaper and grandfather arguments. Hopefully, I showed more specifically that Proust's argument relies on possibility. And then finally, I want to kind of suggest that things can go in the other way around. So people who are interested in the time travel literature should also look to work on causal finitism and the Grim Reaper argument to see if any new insights there and new work there can apply to their field. So hopefully there's kind of a methodological point being made here too. Thank you for your time.
All right. Thank you so much. Can you still hear us? Great, terrific. Thank you so much, Ibrahim, and I'm sure everyone here joins me in using the applause button. great. And now if there are questions, comments, rejoinders. All right, great. So let me just break the ice and ask a first question of my own. I was just wondering, methodologically speaking, if there's a deeper connection that you see. If you feel that the payoff in approaching one paradox via another is speaks to something deeper about conceptual quandaries, or if you think is just you've just used this particular grandfather paradox to tackle that particular Grim Reaper paradox, and it's just particularistic, or if you think there's something larger at stake here.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I mean, I think definitely what I've noticed in the similarity here, the reason that there's this parallel is because both of these paradoxes are trading on what you might call a plausibly true obverse counterpossible. So counterpossibles are just counterfactuals with either an impossible antecedent or an impossible consequent. So an obverse counterpossible is a counterpossible with an impossible or consequent. So one such obverse counterpossible is, if I were to travel back in time, I would kill my grandfather, or yeah, I would have the ability to kill my grandfather. That seems like it's plausibly true, but you might think that's kind of problematic. You can't have those kinds of counterpossibles, so that then rules out the antecedent. And so then the idea is Proust also is using an obverse counterpossible. So he's saying if Jimmy were in the prefix situation, right? He's in the situation with the 959 Reaper, then he would be able to turn the dial. But he can't turn the dial because that creates in the original Zeno-like paradox. So my point is the similarity here comes down to sort of the grassroots intuition has to do with counterpossibles. So that's why there's this structural similarity. But it'd be interesting to consider whether other paradoxes also trade on this intuition about counterpossibles. And so in that sense, it might have broader implications. Now, whether this suggests something about paradoxes in completely other fields, maybe it only suggests this much. When we look at what is intuitively driving sort of the paradox, if you can abstract away as much as possible, you might be able to find another relevant similarity in a different one. So perhaps there's a kind of a methodological point to be made, but broader than that, I don't think so.
Great. So I do have another question, but I don't want to jump queue in case there are other comments. All right, let me just dive in. So this is going to be extremely simple-minded. If we just look at the lamp scenario that you put up on that slide, I thought that was just beautiful. And the way you've put the Grim Reaper paradox is, if I remember correctly, is this, that the lamp is off at 9 a.m., the lamp is on at 11:01. So far, so good. We start moving backwards from 11 to 10:30, 10:15, 10:07, etc. And via the very same kind of reasoning, that particular Grim Reaper can't be the one that turns the light on, right? And so now I want to ask exactly what the paradox is. If I remember correctly, the way you put it was for any Grim Reaper n, there's a Grim Reaper n plus 1. That's, I think what you meant to say was that there's a next Grim Reaper, right? Because it's not necessary that it's the natural numbers, it's the real numbers, right? And there's a next Grim Reaper, okay. And so one immediate sort of very freshman-y reaction to this might be this. Okay, so it's guaranteed that there is a Grim Reaper that does turn the light on. So far, so good. And it's also guaranteed that we don't know which, in this kind of object-dependent Dagher del objeto sense, which that Grim Reaper is, right? And so there's this kind of dedicto de re, or dedicto de objeto difference that we're very familiar with from belief contexts, and so on. Of course, that occasions perhaps other quandaries or seemingly paradoxical situations, but why would this be special, I guess, would the question be.
Yeah, so I don't think the de dicto de re distinction will hinder the force of the paradox, I think, because so the idea is for any reaper, it can't be the reaper that turns it on. Because the reaper turns the lamp on if and only if the lamp is off by the time it's set to check, right? So if the lamp is already on by the time it gets to the reaper does nothing. So because it's a biconditional, if there's an earlier reaper, right? So if I'm the 11 o'clock reaper, I can't be the one to turn on because there's a 10:30 reaper that if it was still off by the time it got to 10:30, right, it would be turned on. And so it's not merely that we don't know which reaper will turn it on, but in fact, it cannot be any of them because no like another way to put this, the condition is that the only way the reaper can be the one to turn the lamp on is if it is the first reaper, right? There is no reaper before it. But given the way we set up the scenario that it is getting closer and closer to 10 o'clock, there is no first reaper. Right. So because there's this dependence relation, you just get that no reaper can turn it on. But because some reaper must turn it on, that is going to be the source of the contradiction.
Right, and so that's what leads to the not being able to shoot your grandfather paradox. Okay.
Yeah, the connection of the grandfather paradox is so because we can alter this situation, right? So with the reapers, you can just add a 959 reaper to the infinites, and then at 959 you have another one, so earlier than all of them. In this case, it's not a contradiction, right? In this case, the 959 reaper just turns it on and everyone else goes home. But the idea is, well, okay, but if this situation is possible, like if we could really build this 959 situation, couldn't someone just like turn the dial of the knife, like push the reaper of the knife all the way here? But if they do that, then we're in a logical, inconsistency. And so the idea is what's motivating that intuition that you could just push the reaper is the same intuition that motivates the idea that, oh, well, if time travel were possible, I could just travel back in time and shoot my grandfather. I mean, I could just do it, right? And so if you think there's something wrong with one, you have to think there's something wrong with the other.
Great, good. Thanks so much. Tremendously fun. Let's see if there's some more questions, comments.
I have a question.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, I guess this is a comment about bibliography, but the solution to the grandfather paradox that you attributed to
Nick Effingham?
Yeah, I think that's been in the literature at least since Lewis's The Paradox of Time Travel, which is a 1976 paper. Just a comment, and I think it goes even more. It goes back to the 60s or something like that. It's been an idea. It's been out for some time. I was also wondering if you've read Alex Malpass's work on this issue. Yeah, okay. Because I think he has some similar ideas to what you're presenting here. That I was just interested. Yeah. So another thing I wanted to ask is, what do you make of the original solution, the one Bernardetti himself posed, that the way you've set it up here, it would be that the lamp is switched on or off, I don't remember, at the exactly at the limit point, and the cause is the totality of all the. I'm sure you're familiar with the solution. I think
Yeah,
he puts it in terms
Hawthorne
of
says this too.
yeah. I think he puts it in terms of bells that ring, and yeah, his setup is a bit different. And I was wondering what you make of that solution.
Yeah. So I guess I'll start with so I do actually want to make a clarification. So Lewis's 1976 solution is a little different from Effingham's. So Lewis's solution is to say that when we have claims, ability claims, or claims that what an agent can do, these claims are context sensitive, right? So the idea is when an agent travels back in time and we say, well, he can kill his grandfather, there are two things we might mean here. We might mean that the agent is killing the grandfather is compossible with the set of facts prior to the attempt, or that it's compossible with just sort of all the facts, including facts about the future, like the grandfather goes on to procreate and make this person, right? So if we consider facts about the future, then the agent just can't because it's inconsistent. But if we only consider facts about the past, the agent can. So when we have these intuitions, we're just sort of messing up the context sensitivity of ability claims. That's the Lewisian solution. What Effingham wants to say is actually something a little more radical, maybe. He wants to say that actually, even if we consider facts about the future, the agent still can do the thing. It's just that can doesn't have any modal consequences. So when we say that the agent is able to do it, even when we consider facts about the future, that doesn't commit us to a possible world where they actually do. So it is a slightly different solution, but that is not really too relevant. The point about Bernardetti's original, and I think that's kind of like what John Hawthorne wants to say as well. The idea is maybe more broadly too. You can just say, look, there are these underlying sort of metaphysical principles about causation that are snuck in here as well. Something like you can't have like a group that does, that acts causally, even if none of the parts act, right? But to me, it seems like this is so. This reply faces a couple of problems in the literature as well, just because you can alter the situation such that this becomes less and less plausible, and you're going to have to give up more and more kind of metaphysical principles. So it doesn't seem like it'll apply to many variants. And to me, it just seems like even if both solve it, I like this grandfather style solution more because it is all I have to commit to is a claim about ability ascriptions, namely that ability ascriptions don't entail modal claims. Whereas with the Bernardetti situation, I'm going to have to commit to really hefty metaphysical principles. I can't think that groups require one of the parts to act or something, right? And this will get even weirder when you have like contact principles and things. So it just seems like a more a less kind of committal solution. So I just think this one, that's the reason I favor this one. Did you want to follow up or?
Yeah, I guess regarding the first part about Lewis, I was wondering if I agree that there's this distinction. I didn't mean to say that they're the same in that part, but I think doesn't it work the same way for your argument, whether would you go with Lewis's analysis or this new analysis of abilities, doesn't it operate in the same way?
So this is a really interesting point, right? So I tried at first just to apply Lewis's solution here. But here's the trouble, right? So imagine we're in the case where we have these infinite reapers, right? It's getting closer to 10 o'clock. And we also have a 9:59 reaper. So perfectly consistent, right? Then let's suppose I'm Jimmy and I'm like, it's 9:58. And I have my hand on the dial, right? And the intuition originally, the naive intuition is, oh, well, I can turn this dial and it'll create this inconsistent scenario. And so we want to say that I can do this, just like in the time travel case, we want to say I can shoot my grandfather. Lewis's solution in the time travel case was to say, can is actually context sensitive. So it matters whether you're taking into account facts about the past or also facts about the future. But I mean, how does an application of that work in the Grim Reaper case? Because it's not as though we're changing or holding fixed facts about the past or future. All that matters to create the inconsistency is that we have a particular spatial arrangement, right? Like these Reapers, there's infinitely many of them. They're in front of me. It's 9:58, right? So there's no temporal facts here that we're playing with. So it's harder to import that. There might be a way to do it. I haven't maybe abstracted enough from Lewis's solution, but Effingham's was more direct, I guess, because all I have to do is deny possibility. Yeah, does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great, thanks so much to both. And I'm delighted to see that we have Professor James Cargo with us from the University of Virginia. Jim, wonderful seeing you. I believe it is 3 a.m. your time, so your commitment is quite outstanding. Thank you for being here. And if there are some more questions, comments, rejoinders for Mr. Dagher, and if not, please join me once more in thanking him.